Okay, I'll assume this is working. I'm Sebastian. This will be a workshop about how to debate Latin America. Broadly speaking, I'd like to cover a few issues. The first of them will be the war on drugs. Secondly, I'll talk about the pink tide and the political spectrum in Latin America overall. Then I'll briefly mention things such as the Odebrecht cases, the rise of the religious rights, and a brief chat about the economy and informality and that sort of jazz. Few warnings first, though. Firstly, I'll try to offer a reasonably balanced view overall of these issues, but obviously they are very polarizing issues, and I have my perspectives. I mean, I'm a Peruvian, I'm a socialist, I'm in opposition to right-wing populists such as Alberto Fujimori, so obviously take everything I say with a grain of salt. Okay, so the first issue I'd like to talk about is about the war on drugs, which is an issue that you'll see very commonly when they talk about Latin America. So for example, in the final of the US University Debating Championships in 2017 and so on, you'll see chats about Mexican cartels, the war on drugs in South America, and so on. So I'll cover three issues here in terms of the war on drugs. One, the production cycle. So three crucial aspects in terms of the production cycle in the war on drugs. One, the Andean regions. In countries like Peru and Colombia and Bolivia, they host more than 98% of production of cocaine. Why is this? I mean, why is this the case? Well, firstly, it's actually quite hard to have a cocaine empire as a one-man Breaking Bad type of operation. Firstly, you need very specific environmental requirements, which you find in the Andean regions. Secondly, you need huge amounts of space. Thirdly, cocaine requires a type of extraction through solvents, which is very hard to carry as the operation of one individual. So basically, what you see is in the Andean countries that have institutions that are very weak and vulnerable, those are the areas in which you see the vast majority of production of cocaine. Just to make clear how profitable this is, 1 gram of cocaine costs approximately $80 in the US and around $3 in Peru. So the profit margins are gigantic. It's not really a huge mystery why this is such a thriving business in these specific areas. The second phase of the production cycle happens in Central America. In Central America, what you see is basically groups that specialize in the transport of cocaine from South America to Mexico. Who carry these things? Basically armed groups such as MS-13 and Barrio 18, what they call themselves the transportistas, the transporters, and these are very often ruthless groups that basically try to make sure that they control the routes of cocaine that go from South America to North America. Where do they come from? Very often they come from militias of people who fought in the civil wars of Central America during the end of the Cold War. So that is why very often they are really powerful and they have a lot of political capital, and they are a huge threat to the stability of the region. The final phase of the production cycle of drugs happens in Mexico, in North America. Basically, what you see here are the cartels, such as, say, the Golfo cartel, the Jalisco cartel, and the Sinaloa cartel. How do they work? Well, basically, they are the wealthiest organizations in the production cycles, and what they do is that they organize the smuggling through the US border. Basically, what they have to do is to control the communities in the northern desert of Mexico, because that is why they get access to the south border of the United States. What has happened in those areas is that the control of the Mexican state has basically collapse. They no longer have like the capability of providing basic services, things like the collection of taxation. Most deaths happen specifically in these areas for the very simple reason that the cartels fight each other for the control of these border areas, because like there is a massive profit that you get from having access to those specific supply lines. So for example, in the Chihuahua Desert, you see the cartel of Sinaloa fighting the cartel of Jalisco, fighting the Golfo cartel, and basically it is a massive, massive bloodshed. Okay, so this is basically how the production cycle works. Coca grows in South America, it goes through Central America, and finally it goes to Mexico, where you have the very wealthy cartels. But the question though is, okay, why should you care? Like, what are the specific impacts of these types of things in Latin American society at large? Four in particular. Firstly, a massive spike in crime. Why is that? Well, for the very simple reason that the infrastructure that you need to defend your supply lines of drugs, very often, I mean things like weapons, like illegal armies, like corrupt associations with authorities and police, very often they are perfect from also making a profit from other crimes as well. So basically, if you have like the whole infrastructure for defending your supply lines in Guatemala, you might as well use those weapons and your small drug lord army for other types of profitable activities, such as kidnapping and asking for ransoms and blackmailing and robbing shops and so on. So basically, what you see is a massive spike on crime. In rural places in El Salvador, you see murder rates close to 1 in 1,000, which is completely immense. Why? Well, for the very simple reason that there is an overall lawlessness caused by these armed groups that dedicate themselves to transporting these drugs. The second thing that you see is massive amounts of impunity and corruption of institutions. Why does this happen? For two reasons, basically. The first of them is that there is a massive lack of transparency in the donations that political parties get. So for example, in Peru, just to see an example, you see that Joaquin Ramirez, the Secretary General of the largest party in Peru, is under an investigation by the DA for trafficking cocaine. Also in Brazil, you see Aécio Neves, who almost won the presidency back in 2014. They found 445 kilograms of cocaine in one of his helicopters. So basically, you see that drug trade also permeates into the political sphere at large and creates an atmosphere of impunity. The second thing, though, is that you also see that the allies of narcos are ingrained into the local bureaucracies that make governments function, especially in the judiciary. So there's this very famous quote by Escobar, which is like, you can take a bullet or you can take a bribe. So basically, there is this network of extortions and bribery that means that the bureaucratic institutions that sustain a lot of Latin American states are basically dysfunctional because of drug trading. The third impact that you see is narco-terrorism. So in the same way that the Taliban in Afghanistan profit from the trade of heroin, you also see that drug trade is an easy source of revenue for armed groups. So for example, that is why you see the FARC in Colombia and Shining Path in Peru. Historically, they made a lot of money and also got, like, I don't know, better weapons and so on by forming strategic alliances with narco groups in the Amazonian region to make sure that they control these areas and get like a part of the revenue that narcos get from trading drugs. The fourth impact that you see is that very often the massive violence that comes from drug trade is one of the push factors that make, especially people in Central America and states such as Honduras and El Salvador and maybe even in northern Mexico, immigrate illegally to the US as the only route to escape violence. Okay, so what can we do about this massive problem that seems to intuitively be quite bad? The problem is basically the following one. There is a number of possible alternatives, which are very often what you hear that people mention in debating rounds. So very often you'll see a comparative between things like legalization or cracking down on consumption or production or using military force against the cartels and so on. The problem is that honestly, none of these alternatives are too great. I'll mention 4 in particular. The first of them is to eradicate the production of cocaine that you see in South America. So basically, you see this through the coca eradication plans that happen in Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. The most famous of those is called the Plan Colombia, which basically is dumping huge amounts of pesticides in coca fields to make sure that the cocaine doesn't get made in the first place. 2 problems with this. 1, it's terrible for the environment. Crucially, the pesticides destroy the soil, which means that these peasants then have absolutely nothing to sustain their lives. But secondly, though, it often erodes, which means that the contamination permeates into all of the agricultural land, which means that you see massive amounts of destruction and basically poor farmers in Andean regions lose all their ways to sustain their own lives because of the coca eradication plans. Secondly, though, it's also really bad for health. There is a lot of solid evidence that this causes a lot of respiratory issues on the people who live in these areas. So overall, what you see is that the plans to eradicate the production of cocaine usually generate a huge amount of backlash from these poor individuals who often come from indigenous groups. Crucially, though, it means that they are reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement in the first place because they know that the consequences of the eradication plan will mean that they are likely to get their own ways of living destroyed because of the destruction of the agricultural land. An interesting alternative might be, for example, what we hear from the Mexican presidential candidate, Manuel López Obrador, who basically offers amnesty for those who grow drugs in Mexico, but also a program of substitution of crops for those Mexican farmers. The problem with this plan, though, is quite evident, and it's the following one. This assumes that drug cartels will willingly and voluntarily give up the control that they have over these agricultural areas without giving a fight. So maybe it is quite plausible, actually. I would say it's very likely that farmers do not like being under the control of these criminal organizations. However, it's not clear that they can exit them voluntarily, which actually takes us to the second possible alternative, which is, okay, if the problem is drug organizations, then let's try to use the military to fight the cartels. This is basically what happened in Mexico under the government of Calderon in 2006. This massively, spectacularly failed. I think around 200,000 people have died because of the failed war on narco launched by Calderon. Why have these efforts failed so spectacularly? Well, quite simply, because firstly, if you try to use the military to fight narco in narco-dominated areas, it's actually quite difficult to distinguish between those who are narcos and those who are civilians. So very often what you see is that violence permeates into completely innocent civilians, and you basically see massive bloodshed overall. But secondly, though, what I would say is that the army, especially in countries that have weak institutions, such as Latin America, is often completely unaccountable. So in northern Mexico, you see instances of massive human rights violations done by the armies themselves. Things like sexual abuse and extortions and illegal executions. So what you generate then is then again a massive backlash by which civilians often prefer the domination of narcos over the intervention of the military. And they're unwilling to cooperate, say, as informants with the federal government for the very simple reason that the army has a long history of abuses and violence and so on. So not clear to me that using the military to fight the cartels works. Crucially, for the very simple reason that the profit margins in these businesses are so large, even if the army is capable, say, of capturing a kingpin and destroying a specific gang, it's just very likely that a new one will be formed. Why? Because the incentives for making a lot of money from trading drugs into the US are so large that it's just very unlikely that you'll ever be capable of stopping the formation of this cartel from happening in the first place. So this alternative doesn't really have a lot of future. The third alternative is to crack down on consumers. Quite simple. What you do is you incarcerate those who buy drugs, and also say the micro sellers. So say you don't go after El Chapo and his cartels, but you go after, say, the micro sellers who are trying to, sell small amounts of coke in Mexico City. Okay, this is also a disaster for a very simple reason. And so you create a massive system of mass incarceration in which huge amounts of non-violent offenders who are likely not a huge threat to society end up in prison. In prison, they lose all their meaningful social connections and prospects of employability, which then means that their only way to sustain their lives is recidivism, to become professional in crime. And this means that actually you make the problem even worse because you send, say, micro sellers and consumers to prison, and then their only way of sustaining their lives is to join a drug gang, which means that things become even worse. And this is especially what you see in places like in Peru, for example. It is quite famous that we have prisons that are massively overcrowded, and there is a massive rate of recidivism and drug gangs that recruit everyone who's sent into these prisons, and very often joining a gang is the only way to survive your stay in prison. So basically, this alternative is quite bad, and plausibly it makes drug crime even worse because it strengthens drug gangs in the first place. Okay, the fourth alternative, which is like the rosy liberal view, is let's just legalize drugs. Two problems with this. The first problem with this is that, one, if you only legalize drugs locally, so say Colombia legalizes drugs, but the US does not legalize drugs, nothing will ever change. Why? For a very simple reason. Drug cartels specialize in sending drugs to the United States and the developed world. If the developed world does not legalize drugs, then cartels are still necessary because you need some sort of illegal organization that specializes in the transport of those drugs. So basically, you plausibly make the problem even worse because by legalizing them locally, governments cannot do much to fight against the production of drugs, but the criminal organizations are still there because they're still needed to transport those drugs to the Western world. So local legalization, probably not a great idea. The second thing, though, is, okay, let's be very generous and let's assume that legalization happens worldwide. Why is this still very likely to not work? Well, let's just be very clear. For legalization to work, it would have to be plausible that formal businesses, say in the United States, are able to overtake the distribution of cocaine, say, from the cartels in Mexico. Why is this unlikely to work? A few reasons. One, cartels have structural advantages because of things like bonded labor. Secondly, they don't have to pay any money in taxation. Thirdly, they can intimidate their competitors. Things like, I don't know, sending hitmans and destroying their factories and so on. Like, they are organizations that have billions of dollars and they are known to be ruthless. So they are likely to crack down on all of their competitors. Fourthly, finding the actual soil outside of the Andes to do things like growing massive numbers of cocaine actually be difficult. So for all of these reasons, it's just really, really plausible that no formal business would ever like to enter the legal drug market, because basically the possible risks of, you know, being the victim of the fury of the Sinaloa cartel, who does not want to lose their business, is just too large. So probably investors will not bother trying to build up a formal business of cocaine, given that the investment is very risky and uncertain and so on. So basically, legalization, not very clear that it will work in the first place. Okay. This is where we get to an interesting motion, which is basically the following one. This house, as the Mexican government, would allow the Sinaloa cartel to monopolize the production of drugs. Why is this motion there? Well, basically, I think the context that is vital is that very often the violence that you see between drug cartels happens because of the competition for these specific areas that allow them to access the US border. So what the motion is suggesting is that it is quite likely that violence will significantly go down if we make sure that these cartels stop fighting each other and we allow just one of them to monopolize power. Which actually begs the question of why would cartels care? I mean, like, yeah, you allow one cartel to monopolize power in northern Mexico. Why would that cartel care about, say, not being ruthless and basically blackmailing everyone, destroying businesses and causing overall misery? Plausibly, a reason why that would make sense is that cartels make money by forcing local businesses to pay rent. So what you could plausibly argue is that actually, if one of these cartels monopolizes power, they would have the incentive to allow for these regions to have a degree of stability and prosperity, because the better that these businesses are economically, the more they can pay in rents. So it is quite likely that it is not the worst of alternatives to allow the cartels to take over and monopolize power, for the very simple reason that plausibly the worst of all outcomes is a type of full-on multi-front civil war between different types of organizations. Okay, for those who like further reading, I would recommend Narconomics, How to Run a Drug Cartel, a very fun book. They talk about things like the production cycle, how gangs distribute the drugs in the US, South American prison gangs, and so on. It's a cool book. Okay. Basically, that is enough on the war on drugs. Now I'd like to talk about the pink tide, Chavismo, in the political spectrum in South America. A lot of motions get set on the crisis in Venezuela, most famously that round in Euros about South American nations should materially support a coup in Venezuela. Okay, so to explain Venezuela, I'd like to first mention 2 points of context to contextualize the pink tide overall. So first, there is a massive post-Cold War backlash against American interventionism in Latin America. Famously, the US has done things like funding right-wing military dictatorships, such as those of Videla, and such as those of Pinochet, and such as those of Stroessner in Paraguay, basically to crack down on communism in South America. The crucial thing here is that there is a massive backlash against the perceived imperialism of the US in the region. But secondly, though, there is also a massive backlash against things like the privatizations are recommended by the IMF, and there is overall a perception that Western institutions don't really care about, say, the people of South America. They just care about these abstract factors like decreasing public debt burdens and blah, 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 blah. So there's this very strong rhetoric that the international institutions of the West do not care for the best interests of the people of Latin America. Secondly, though, I think a crucial thing to specify is that the difference between left and right in South America is actually quite different from the difference between left and right, say, in the Western world, especially in the US, also in Europe. Traditionally, what we see in, say, the US is debates about the permissibility of the welfare state, or I don't know, decreasing the role of government, blah, 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 and you see left-leaning social liberal parties and right-wing, more conservative parties. This doesn't really happen traditionally in Latin America for a few reasons. One, there is a broad consensus in favor of the welfare state. So very often you see, like, I don't know, like the famous networks of patronage and clientelism are very widespread amongst both the left and the right. So I don't know, famously on left, you have people like the Peronistas in Argentina, who are famous for their networks of handouts to those who are very poor. But also in Peru, say, you have people like the Fujimori family, who are very well known for having networks of food handouts to those who vote for them. So basically, I think there is a consensus on both the left and the right that there is some sort of role that the government has in spending money to provide those who are very poor with services. And also things like, I don't know, welfare payments, public healthcare, all of those things are basically out of question. They are assumed by both sides of the political spectrum. What's crucial, though, is the following thing. Very often, the main clash between the left and the right is based on how much should the government limit the free market in terms of interacting with global markets. So, for example, one of the crucial debates is about things like the privatization of public services, things like policies of free trade versus policies of substitution of like imports that happened a lot in the 70s in South America. Or, I don't know, debates about signing free trade deals. So what I would say is actually this type of modern dichotomy that you see in places like The Economist, in which they say left and right doesn't really matter anymore in the West. The real clash now is open versus closed. I would say in many ways that has been the debate in Latin America for decades. And things like the size of the welfare state are actually not very much into question. Okay, so having made those two caveats also, social conservatism. Traditionally, this is starting to change, I would say, in the last decade or so. But traditionally, social conservatism was also the consensus, both in the left and the right. So I don't know, gay marriage was not like a debatable issue because like basically everyone was against it very vigorously. Abortion rights were considered completely impermissible, both by left and the right. So I would say that the split on left and right based on social issues is actually not a thing traditionally in Latin American politics. This is starting to change, though, with the rise of evangelical mega churches, but I'll mention that a bit later. Okay, with those 2 points of context, what is the pink tide? Well, firstly, as you'll see, they call it the pink tide, not the red tide. Why? Well, for the very simple reason that when we talk about the pink tide, more than hardcore Marxists or ideological socialists who I don't know, read the Communist Manifesto every single night before going to bed. They are a group of ultra-nationalists who support things like enhancing national pride, closing down their economies, opposing trade with the Western world, rejecting the privatizations advised by the IMF. Basically, they ditched the Washington consensus, but not in favor of some sort of radical socialism, but rather, I'd say, some sort of protectionist center-left nationalism, let's say. Who are the members of the pink tide? Traditionally, I think the candidates, the obvious names are Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Kirchner in Argentina. More controversially, Lula and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, although I think very arguable given how centrist their governments were in nature. Humala in Peru is also named as one of the members of the pink tide, and also people like Ortega in Nicaragua, although that is slightly different because he has a very long history in Nicaraguan politics in the Sandinista army. But basically, that is the pink tide. So in the early 2000s and late 90s, you saw a massive surge in this center-left nationalists who opposed the integration with Western markets. And they captured power in the vast, vast majority of countries in South America and Central America. Some of the policies that they supported include, firstly, the nationalization of oil and gas. Secondly, strong subsidies for domestic businesses. Things like an embrace of the protectionism that was widespread in the 70s, but was later ditched. And thirdly, policies such as the control of currency flows and so on. And also, like, I don't know, rejecting the independence of central banking, and those types of things. So basically, having a tight control of the free market by government authorities. Okay, so how was it? Was it bad? Was it good? The thing is, the assessment is not so simple, given that the pink tide had significant differences in each individual country where it happened. So, for example, Bolivia and Ecuador actually achieved unprecedented degrees of stability and economic growth. Bolivia, for example, has reduced poverty in huge amounts. Bolivia basically is a nation and it's mainly indigenous Aymara. However, they never had an indigenous head of state. Evo Morales is the first of them. He's often seen as a person that has allowed the Aymaras to have a sense of national pride and dignity, and he's relatively popular there, and he's often considered a decent president, let's say. Definitely not a disaster. The thing, though, is that in other countries, say Argentina, they after, say, the government of the Kirchners, they had massive scandals of briberies. They had a struggling debt burden and a crippling rate of inflation. So basically, the thing is the following thing. The economic impacts have been very different depending on what states we're talking about. I would say, though, that a crucial thing that we can generalize happened in the pink tide is that in the early 2000s, we had South America had a commodities boom caused by the growth of China, who was buying more and more raw materials. What this caused was a very obvious thing, which is that governments had a lot of money, a lot of spare cash to spend. So they started spending in social policies, in social spending, in subsidies for food, in subsidies for oil, and so on. And I don't know, they could sustain public enterprises that functioned at a huge loss, such as Petrobras in Brazil, which is massively inefficient and filled with cronyism, or Copencosur, a sugar cooperative in Brazil, also very inefficient. All of those things were sustainable because of the massive numbers of government revenue that they got because of the commodities boom. When those things started declining, governments were not capable to sustain those massive amounts of public spending in the long term. What is basically led is that pink tide governments have either moderated themselves greatly, such as, say, in the case of Ecuador, in which Lenin Moreno, who was the vice president of Korea, won the presidency, but has significantly moderated his discourse, and I don't know, now is pursuing some sort of approach of trying to reduce fiscal burdens and decrease like public spending and so on. So basically, either they have moderated their discourse or they've lost power, which is what happened, say, in Argentina, in which Mauricio Macri beat the candidate of the left, but also the case in Brazil, in which, say, Dilma Rousseff was impeached. But largely that was possible because her popularity had significantly waned during those years because of economic instability and scandals of mismanagement. So basically, the pink tide is turning. It's basically either gone or going away in the vast majority of countries in South America. A second thing that's crucial to remember about the pink tide is their tendencies towards authoritarianism. So how does this work? One very important aspect is that it's not very useful to think like in terms of black-white dictatorship democracy. It's actually a little bit of both. Stephen Levitsky, I'd call it competitive authoritarianism. There is a paper under that name and also a book, which is very, very, very good. Basically, what he mentioned is the following thing. Competitive authoritarianism is a place in which you do have elections that are regular, and I don't know, like there are no outrageous electoral fraud, so they don't like literally rewrite the ballots. However, the elections are not fair. For the very simple reason that, say, you have a huge amount of intimidation of those who stand on the opposition. You have intimidation of journalists, which is, for example, what happened in Ecuador. Or you also have things like I don't know, government using their powers to significantly increase the barriers of entry for those who want to oppose them. So I don't know, like they make it really hard to sign in a new political party. They often do things like state-owned media basically works as a propaganda tool for those who are incumbents in power, and so on. So basically, it's not that any of these states, with the exception of Venezuela, which we'll mention later, completely violated democracy. The point is that they exercise democracy, but they distorted the system to significantly increase the chances of incumbents winning re-election. However, as you can see, this does not mean that they could not, in principle, lose an election, and in fact, they lost them. They lost power in Argentina. Evo Morales asked for a referenda in Bolivia, trying to cancel the existence of term limits for the presidency, and he lost, and so on. So the point being, yes, they tried to entrench themselves into power, but for a variety of reasons, they could never completely dissolve democracy, and this meant that ultimately they were ousted from power democratically. Now, how good or how terrible the governments who replaced the pink type were, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Okay, so what happened specifically though in Venezuela, because Venezuela seems to be the outlier, and it quite is, for a few reasons. One, Venezuela is the outlier for the very simple reason that the economic policies pursued by the Venezuelan government were far more extreme and radical in nature than those pursued by any other type of government that happened during the pink tide. Secondly, though, the degree of crackdown on democracy and destruction of the basic institutions that make democracy function happened in Venezuela at an unprecedented level. So, what exactly happened in Venezuela? Okay, one, Venezuela is a very, very oil-rich state. However, this did not translate into material gains for Venezuelan people for decades. So, for example, in the 1990s, you had Venezuela being the country with the largest amount of oil reserves in the world, but they had a poverty rate of around 65%. So basically what you had was a dysfunctional democratic system, was very close in ties with the United States, and the huge amounts of people who were very poor and who did not really see any material benefits from those oil revenues. This is where Hugo Chavez comes into power. Hugo Chavez was born in massive economic deprivation in one of the slums of Venezuela. He was very charismatic and telegenic, an army officer. He carried, I don't know, this type of macho persona of a guy who tells it like it is and fights against like the elite establishment forces of Venezuela. He attempted a coup, but lost and was sent to prison in 1992. But then he won a presidential election in the late 90s under a platform basically of fighting the political establishment and fighting against charges of mismanagement and corruption and redistributing wealth. He won in a landslide. He won in the first round of voting with, I think, 55%. So what happened? Chavez massively increased social spending. There's this thing called the Bolivarian missions, which is that he did things like open up hospitals and soup kitchens in poor areas in Venezuela. And he reduced poverty by huge numbers, I think around 30% or more. So this means that he became tremendously popular with the working class of Venezuela. Basically, he had like a fanatical following. He was seen as a liberator, as a savior who was redistributing wealth and who actually cared for the Venezuelan working man. And for the first years, it seemed to be working, but it was very problematic given that he never really seemed to care about building like a sustainable model that incentivize the redistribution of wealth in a sustained manner. What he seemed to have only really cared about was using the government as a center for giving handouts to those who were willing to vote for him. So that is why I would say he still corresponded to the typical model of clientelism in South America. However, the opposition, the right-wing parties, greatly disliked him. So that is why they attempted a coup in 2002 that failed, and a recall referenda in 2004. Both of these attempts failed spectacularly. They failed massively. Why? Well, for the very simple reason that Chavez was very popular and very well liked. So what happened after these attempts is that Chavez massively radicalized. So I think it's quite plausible to say that before these attempts, he was reasonably within the spectrum of things that we saw during the pink tide. Basically, it's like a lot of government spending, an increase of government debt, but basically nothing too radical, nothing too ambitious at transforming the entire system. This changed. Chavez radicalized and pursued three policies that massively changed the situation of Venezuela, and I think are basically what caused the crisis that Venezuela is in right now. One, he purged the management of state-owned companies, especially in PDVSA, which is the national oil company. This means that government bureaucracies, especially the judiciary branch, but also the management of the major companies in oil and gas, were replaced by cronies who were personally loyal to Hugo Chavez. Why did it happen? Well, for the very obvious reason that he was very paranoid, for understandable reasons. And he knew that unless he had a control that was very direct with people he could personally trust, it was very likely that the opposition could try to use, say, I don't know, strikes in oil companies or the judicial branch to try to oust him from power. So he did that. Two, he nationalized all telecom and electricity industries. He also had a vigorous crackdown on journalists who criticized him. His basic argument was that journalism basically does not give a voice to the people, but it's basically a tool of the capitalist establishment of Venezuela. So basically, what he was able to do was to silence the voices of those who were criticizing him or trying to scrutinize the corruption scandals of Congress and so on. So what I would say is that the crackdown on free speech in Venezuela reached a level that was unprecedented during other types of governments that were associated with the pink tide. The third thing that he did when he radicalized, and this is very, very important, is that he created a massive Bolivarian militia. What is this? Basically, he trained groups of civilians to create armed cells that are only personally loyal to him and the Socialist Party of Venezuela. Why is this the case? I would posit that after the failed coup, he lost a degree of trust in the military. So what this means is that he wanted to make sure that the executive in Venezuela had an armed group that only responded to them and that he could trust personally. So this is why he started handing out massive amounts of heavy weaponry in the Caracas slums to form these types of armed groups of people who basically swear to defend Chavez and the Socialist Party in case of a coup or an attempt of revolution and so on. Why is this so important? Well, firstly, I would posit handing out massive amounts of weapons in the slums of a country is probably a terrible idea because it's going to obviously increase crime, and that is exactly what happened. Like, there is a huge amount of illegal weapons, often heavy weapons like AK-47s, who are basically roaming around the black markets of Venezuela because they were introduced by the Chavez government in the first place because they wanted to form their militia. Secondly, though, I think this is one of the main reasons why a lot of military options in Venezuela are just not very viable, for the very simple reason that even if for some reason you could get a sizable portion of the army to support a coup against someone like Maduro, you would still have to get rid of the massive militias who are basically stationed at the core of the huge cities and urban centers of Venezuela. So it is likely that any type of violent alternative that tries to oust Maduro by force is likely to be a massive bloodshed. So I think it's just not very plausible to say that a transition of power that involves removing Maduro by force is not going to create massive amounts of civilian casualties. So, okay. Chavez did his radical reforms, and he was still very popular. He won 4 elections. As I say, it is true that the elections were not fair in terms that the opposition, I don't know, had massive amounts of structural barriers. But it is also true that those votes that Chavez got were real. People still really liked him. In 2007, he won a 3rd term by 62% in the first round. So the thing is, like, he was very, very, very liked until the moment he died. But then the disaster happened. In 2013, Hugo Chavez died of cancer. Maduro, his vice president, lacks his charisma, personal force, and I don't know, like his type of dynamic political intelligence that allowed Chavez to dominate Venezuelan politics for around 20 years. Maduro lacks all of those skills. So what we've seen with Maduro is an increasing turn into authoritarianism for the very simple reason that he's not able to win power democratically like Chavez was. So what happened? Oil prices collapsed in 2013. I mean, Maduro wins power in a very hard-fought election against Enrique Capriles. Maduro only won by around 1%. So Maduro wins, he's elected. But the thing is, like, oil prices start falling down. So his very economic model becomes unsustainable in the very first months of his presidency. So, what happens? Maduro cannot really reform the economic system because basically the controlled economy of Venezuela allows Maduro to empower a small network of cronyism, especially amongst like army officers, who are basically those who sustain them in power in the first place. So, for example, 1, the currency controls are massive, but they allow the elites of Venezuela to make a lot of money through trading those artificially inflated bolivars in the black market. So the thing is, like, it's not like Maduro could simply like become a Chicago boy at the next day and he would still be in power. It's just very implausible to see how he could substantially change the economy but not lose power. Whatever. So what is the disaster? To be very clear. First, inflation is rampant. It's around 500 annual, which is completely insane. I mean, like, right now, Venezuela is the country with the largest percentage of inflation in the entire world. Secondly, he has price controls that are very vicious, and basically they exist for a very simple reason. Price controls mean that Maduro and the elites can access very cheap dollars, which they can then use in the black market. The black market in Venezuela is rampant for the very simple reason that price controls means that formally selling stuff is completely unprofitable, because like in many instances, the price cap is below production cost. So obviously what you see is a massive shortage of basic goods. So for example, there is a massive lack of food. Maduro is doing desperate measures like the expropriation of food markets, arguing that capitalists are hoarding things and blah, 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 for the very simple reason that he's desperate and he's trying to avoid the whole system from collapsing for as much time as he can. The final thing, though, is that the oil output is falling. Why? Because of incompetent management caused by the massive degree of cronyism in the public enterprises of Venezuela. And you basically see things like refinery fires, which means that the output of oil is falling. So not only prices are falling, but the output of oil is also falling. All of this means that government revenue is basically disappearing, and it's very, very likely that Venezuela will default by the end of this year. What this means is basically there is no investment in Venezuela. The government is broke because of massive debts. People in Venezuela have no purchasing power for the very simple reason that the inflation rates are ridiculous. Businesses are broke because of price controls. And basically, the only ones who get anything out of all of this is Maduro, his small group of cronies, things like, I don't know, those who work in militias, who enjoy handouts. But the situation is even worse for the following reason. The opposition in Venezuela is divided. The last time there was an election that had, say, some degree of legitimacy in Venezuela was the parliamentary election that happened, I think, in 2016, but I might be wrong. The opposition won 2/3 of seats in parliament. Maduro then used the courts, who are packed with cronies close to his political party, to cancel the power of Congress. He closed Congress through a judicial order for a couple days. Immediately, what he did is he called for a constitutional assembly that will write a new constitution and replace Congress. The thing is pretty simple, though. The opposition wins a majority handily in the elections in Venezuela, and then Congress basically gets closed down. Then there is an election that elects the Constitutional Assembly. But the problem is that obviously now these elections have absolutely no degree of legitimacy. It is likely that turnout was below 5%. So obviously the Constitutional Assembly, I think, is controlled by Chavistas, I think about 95%. But the thing is the following one. The opposition right now is very fragmented in Venezuela because they are not sure what strategy to pursue. So for example, you have people like Henry Falcón, who argues that no, the opposition should keep trying to participate in elections, even if the elections are rigged. You also have other people who are, I would say, the majority of the opposition forces in Venezuela, who are basically saying, no, what we have to do is to boycott the elections that Maduro calls, because right now it's not even competitive authoritarianism, it's just authoritarianism. Like, there is absolutely no degree of fairness, like it's not even in principle possible to win in these rigged elections. The problem is the following thing. If the majority of opposition forces in Venezuela are not even willing to participate in elections because they are rigged, then the question is, what is the best alternative for removing Maduro? One, sanctions. Not very clear to me how sanctions are likely to work in the long term, for the very simple reason that it seems to me that Maduro has a tight grip on the military. He probably has enough money to like keep giving the necessary amounts of money and privileges to this small group, say, I don't know, 50,000 soldiers who are basically the key parts of sustaining his regime. And yeah, sure, like the vast majority of people in Venezuela might starve, but that's not necessarily a thing that will doom him. Like, insofar as he still has the support of elite groups, so I don't know, those who manage the oil companies, those who manage the state bureaucracies and so on, not clear to me how he's gonna fall. So sanctions, not exactly clear how they are likely to work. 2, military intervention, disaster, probably civil war, massive bloodshed. Elections, not an alternative really. Maduro seems to be very keen on bringing them. So how exactly to tackle the situation in Venezuela? I don't think it's very clear at all, especially if we consider the following thing. Maduro knows that when he loses power, he's gonna go to prison. He might even be like executed by mob violence a la Gaddafi. Why is this the case? Well, like obviously, like it's painfully obvious that all high-ranking officers in the military are deeply ingrained in the corruption apparatus of Chavismo. So the thing is like all generals, all mid-ranking officers, all of them, like all government bureaucrats who work in PDVSA and so on, all of them are entirely sure that the day that Maduro loses power and the opposition wins the presidency and controls the system, they're gonna go to prison. Like, so the thing is, they will keep onto power desperately, and it's not even clear how this situation ends in a way that's not a disaster. One final note on Venezuela. Huge amounts of Venezuelan immigrants, or refugees, I would say, have escaped to nearby Latin American states, crucially Panama, Colombia, and Peru. These Venezuelan diasporas, I think, are generating a degree of backlash in the countries that they are coming to. So, for example, in Peru, there is a rise of xenophobia against Venezuelan refugees who are escaping Chavismo. Initially, there was a huge amount of sympathy for them, but right now there are around, I think, 200,000 or something like that. But the thing is, like, quite interestingly, those who are escaping Chavismo are fueling right-wing populist xenophobia, because there is like a perceived invasion by outside forces. Obviously, this whole crisis in Venezuela is likely to make worse the refugee crisis in South America, especially if things become worse, like I don't know, if there is a full-on civil war, which is not happening right now, but it's not totally implausible. It is likely that we will see a massive refugee crisis in South America in a similar way that there is right now a refugee crisis caused by the Syrian civil war. I would say that right now we are not there, but it could happen in the near future. Okay, so that is enough of the pink tide and all of that. Now I'd like to briefly mention other issues, quite briefly, that I think might be useful for understanding Latin America. Third, corruption. The Odebrecht case. What is the Odebrecht case? It is a multinational construction group specialized in public-private associations in construction projects. So things like roads, dams, bridges, and so on. What happened? Basically, their whole business model consisted in handing out huge bribes for politicians and contributing to campaigns in exchange for getting access to these infrastructure projects. So basically, they hand out money to governors, to presidents, to cabinet members, and to local leaders to make sure that they got the concessions for building things like bridges and blah, blah, blah. Okay, why is this important? Well, quite simply, because there is a US case called US Department of Justice versus Odebrecht, which basically exposed the gigantic networks of briberies, and this has touched even national heads of state. So, for example, Lula is currently in prison because of the Odebrecht scandal related to Operation Car Wash. Ollantumala of Peru is currently accused of bribery. Dilma Rousseff is also in heavy trouble because of the Odebrecht scandals. So all of these are figures on the left who are basically in huge, huge trouble because of the accusations of corruption. But also those on the right, people like Peña Nieto in Mexico, like Santos in Colombia, or PPK, the president of Peru, who faced an impeachment vote and had to quit the presidency because of the corruption scandals of Odebrecht. So the crucial thing is the following one. Right now, the Odebrecht scandals have caused a massive destabilization and a lack of trust in the institutions of Latin America, especially in the traditional spectrum of political parties. Why is that? Because one of the strategies that Odebrecht had was to hand out huge bribes to both political parties. So I mean, they were not specifically selective in that, I don't know, favoring the left or the right. Very often, they handed out money to both candidates who advanced in the roundoffs in presidential elections. So the whole political class and spectrum of political parties has lost a massive amount of legitimacy after the Odebrecht scandals. So, fourth, we know that the pink tide faded, and we know that the political class has lost huge amounts of legitimacy. This begs the question, okay, so who is surging right now? Where is the populist energy in Latin America right now? The problem is, right now, I would say there is a surge in a US-style right-wing populist Christian right, who's also very nativist and relatively xenophobic. Traditionally, Latin American politics have not been dominated by the culture wars that you often see in the discourse in US politics. Social issues have traditionally been secondary to economic issues that predominantly resemble class politics. So you would have, say, center-right parties that dominated urban areas and, say, the middle classes, and also center-left parties who basically got a lot of votes from rural indigenous farmers in isolated areas, but also say from trade unions and blue-collar workers and blah, blah, blah. So basically, class politics. However, Christian fundamentalism seems to be gaining energy. Right-wing populism is making a comeback after the pink tide. Why is this happening? I would say there are three things in particular. One, center-left parties often dominated working class politics in the early 2000s. Basically, like the populist energy, the hopes and expectations of working class people who had very tough lives relied on the left, on things like economic justice and so on. Actually, people like Lula, for example, was born as a very poor steel worker. He never went to a tertiary educational institution. He was very poor. He was a union leader. So I think the leaders of the pink tide had this type of inspirational stories that they are people just like you, they are part of the work of the working class, they will change the entire political system, they will fight against the corruption of elites, blah, blah, blah. When this didn't happen, there's now a void and an overall feeling that there is like a moral vacuum, that politics are devoid of the basic moral values, that there is no decency. And I think very often Christian fundamentalists are seizing on this overall atmosphere of skepticism in the moral character of politicians in Latin America. Secondly, there is a massive rise of evangelical churches. They've made substantial inroads in struggling communities of people who basically live in the outskirts. So I don't know, in the slums of Lima, in the favelas of Brazil. You see massive amounts of evangelical churches for opening things like soup kitchens, like small hospitals, and so on, because this is a way for them to access these vulnerable groups. So very often they are the only source that they have to have, I don't know, some sort of services and access to health, and also things like moral integrity. I mean, like, I don't know, their only access to counseling is to talk with these evangelical preachers. I mean, like, these are people with tough lives, so I don't think that they have any sort of access to mental health facilities or anything. So like, the thing is the following thing. The only relief that they have for their daily problems often comes from the types of ceremonies that they get from these religious organizations. Very often, they've been very neglected, even by the Catholic Church. And the thing is, that is why they make substantial inroads in these communities. The third thing is that there is a massive backlash against the increasing cultural liberalism of college-educated urban elites. What do I mean by this? It is true that some areas in Latin America are more liberal than ever. So, for example, Lima elected 2 gay senators in the elections of 2016. This would be unthinkable even 10 years ago. Why is this happening? I would say that there is a cultural shift, especially amongst those who are young and who live in urban areas, who have, say, I don't know, more access to US media and so on. But the thing is, this is also producing a massive amount of backlash from working class people who basically see this as an act of alienation, as a degradation of moral values. And this is why all of these things are fueling the power of Christian fundamentalists. So what are some concrete case studies of these things happening? 5 in particular. Firstly, the rise of Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, who might be called the South American Trump. After the imprisonment of Lula, he's now the front runner in the elections of Brazil. He's very well known, firstly, for his rhetoric against Haitian immigrants, for being a staunch supporter of Donald Trump, for publicly making appalling jokes about sexual assault, and for publicly admitting that he wished gay people would die. Why is he winning so much power? Well, firstly, because he has this type of macho persona of a tough guy who will fight against crime with a strong hand, because of his strong network of evangelical churches who are mobilizing voters and energizing them, especially in poor areas of Brazil. And also because of like, he's an outsider, he's never held like a major post in the executive branch, so I think he's seen as a different person who will bring some kind of decency and integrity in a way that, say, Lula and the Workers' Party overall failed to actually do in Brazilian politics. Secondly, Fabricio Alvarado in Costa Rica. He's a Mike Pence type cultural warrior. Basically, this is what happened. Costa Rica, I would say, is a relatively liberal nation by Latin American standards. However, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. This generated a massive massive backlash from huge amounts of working class people who saw this as like, I don't know, like an act of unelected judges trying to infringe on the will of the people. This meant that a complete unknown and evangelical fundamentalist who was, before entering politics, known as a singer of Christian folk, massively surged in the elections. Like, the election wasn't happening in 2 weeks. The legalization of gay marriage happened, and then this dude massively surges, and he advances in the first place to the round-off. But then in the round-off, he lost by a sizable margin, like 20 points. The thing is the following one. This is a clear case of how there is a direct backlash against actions of unelected groups who are often perceived as being elites who are detached from working families on the ground. Third example is Jimmy Morales. Jimmy Morales is formerly a comedian in Guatemala. What happened in Guatemala is that there was a number of massive scandals of bribery that led to the destitution of the president. This means that trust in traditional institutions and political organizations disappeared. Jimmy Morales, who ran as an outsider who would bring back traditional values, and he also ran like a rampantly homophobic and misogynistic campaign, and he won in a landslide. One of the most thrilling aspects of Jimmy Morales is that he's a denier of the genocide against the Ixil Maya people in Guatemala. So once again, what we are seeing is this far-right extremist figures getting very close to power because of the overall lack of trust in traditional institutions and political parties. Fourth example, mass mobilizations. What we are seeing is that in places like Dominican Republic, Mexico, Paraguay, and Colombia, evangelical churches are organizing massively to try to ban books in public schools that explain the fluid nature of gender identity and human sexuality. So, for example, they call this thing gender ideology, and they have movements such as "Don't Mess with My Children." These are very crucial pressure groups that generate massive demonstrations and are even so powerful that they have the capacity of doing stuff like they forced the Secretary of Education in Peru to quit because of massive public outcry. In Colombia, they were crucial, for example, to mobilize and vote against the peace deal with the FARC, because part of the peace deal had some segments that made use of language that alluded to LGBT rights and feminism, and they were vigorously against those things. In Brazil, evangelicals were also instrumental in directing the impeachment against Dilma Rousseff because of her support of abortion rights. So the thing is, these evangelical groups are still a minority. However, they are growing. In Peru, they are close to 20%. In Brazil, they are close to 30%. And they are pressure groups who are very crucial because they are very well organized and they're very easy to mobilize. The final thing is that they are influencing mainstream right-wing parties. Two quick examples. In Colombia, Iván Duque won the nomination of the major right-wing party of Colombia. He was historically a social liberal. However, there was a massive degree of outcry from evangelical groups who forced him to flip-flop and to adopt a more conservative stance on social issues such as gender identity. Why is that? Because it is becoming very unviable to politically survive as a right-winger in South America without pandering to some degree to the evangelical groups that are growing, which is very similar actually to what happens right now with the Republican Party in the US. So I don't know, people like Mitt Romney, who's a Massachusetts Northeastern Republican has to pander to the Mike Huckabees because otherwise he would never win the Republican nomination. A second example is the flip-flop of Keiko Fujimori, who once said that she supported gay civil unions, but then there was a massive evangelical backlash and she had to flip-flop. So the thing is the following thing. Even if evangelicals do not outright win power, which honestly, it's not extremely likely that we are going to see like a inverse ping fight in which South America has 10 evangelical heads of state, at least not in the near future. I see it very unlikely. It is likely, though, that they will become huge power brokers in right-wing parties in a way that the relatively socially apathetic center-right parties of South America will merge into regional variations of the GOP, which means that all candidates have to significantly pander to evangelical fundamentalists if they want to stand a chance, say, winning primary elections. Okay, so the fifth issue that I'd like to talk about is that of environmental conflicts. First, why do they happen? Well, as you heard, a huge amount of the economy of Latin American states, say that of Peru and Brazil and Ecuador, comes from the extraction of raw materials and resources, in many cases to sell them to China, that is booming and buying a lot of these raw materials and minerals. Okay, the problem is where these raw materials and minerals are located. Well, firstly, very often minerals are found in the Andean regions that are inhabited by traditional indigenous groups who often speak indigenous languages like Aymara or Quechua. And secondly, you often see things like massive amounts of oil and in some cases gold found in the Amazonian region inhabited by indigenous groups such as the Ashaninka and so on. The thing is the following. There's one massive problem, and it is that it is relatively incompatible for governments to accommodate the preferences of the majority of people who live in urban areas and who enjoy the economic gains of the prosperity that is brought about by economic growth of selling raw materials, and to accommodate the needs of indigenous groups who obviously do not want for these areas to be drilled, because one, it's going to destroy their agricultural lands, two, it's going to destroy their water supplies, because like the massive amounts of procedures that are used in things like mining or drilling oil, and thirdly, because of like the health risks associated with things like cyanide mining that is very common in these areas. So the thing is, in all cases, in the vast majority of cases, those who win in this clash are obviously the majorities of people who live in urban areas. Like indigenous groups have a very limited amount of political capital, and this is quite interesting. Even a lot of governments who are often considered left-leaning and part of the pink tide have actually had terrible relationships with indigenous groups in Amazonian or Andean areas for the very simple reason that they are very pro the extraction of resources. So for example, Correa in Ecuador had a lot of problems because of drilling in Amazonian regions, and a lot of indigenous groups were vigorously against him. And also in Peru, Humala also supported a lot of mining and drilling at projects that won him the opposition en masse of people in federations of Amazonian tribes. So the thing is the following one. It's not very simple to see how you accommodate the needs of both of these groups, like the need of economic growth and of sustaining their traditional ways of living. The crucial aspect, though, is that even in cases in which it is, I mean, like, even if the government does not do anything and say these types of projects for extraction of minerals do not happen at a formal level, South America has a massive problem of illegal informal mining. So the thing is, like, even if the government decides to do nothing and allow these indigenous groups to live their lives as they please, still, they are going to get continuously harassed by illegal miners and criminal organizations who are trying to extract those resources on their own. So say in the Amazonian jungle right now, it's filled with a lot of massive criminal organizations dedicated to illegal mining, and they also do other things like human trafficking and the extortion of local businesses and people. So the thing is the following: it's not so easy to see what is the ideal solution. And it gets even worse when the groups we are talking about are those who are not very integrated, say, within the whole framework of governments. Like, not necessarily people who are uncontacted in Amazonian areas, but say people who have a limited degree of contact and interaction with government. Like, it's not so clear what governments can do to help them in the first place. It's not even that clear that they would welcome the help or government action in the first place. In some cases, it's very clear. Like, for example, there's a very interesting case. You can actually watch the documentary on Netflix. It's called When Two Worlds Collide. This happened in Peru, in the Amazonian region of Conga, mining project. And they basically demanded that government make sure that their water supplies would not get harmed during the extraction of minerals. Obviously, government did not do that. They did not negotiate a deal with indigenous groups, and there was a bloodshed because they tried to resist the extraction. They kidnapped a lot of petrol engineers who were in that area. They killed some of them, then the police killed even more indigenous people. And so basically, it is not clear what is the ideal solution for these areas, whether it is more government involvement, but it's not even clear that government is a benevolent actor in the first place, but also non-government actors have a lot of negative traits. So basically, environmental conflicts do not have a cookie-cutter easy solution either. Okay. So basically, those are the aspects I wanted to cover when I mentioned how to debate Latin America. The crucial thing which I'd like to make sure is the following thing. Latin America is a very diverse area. Obviously, I have not covered all of the possible issues. So, for example, Brazilian politics are very complicated and integrated, and it's not very clear that I can cover all of these issues in one video, but I think this is basically a sketch of the overall thing. So my overall lessons would be the following one. One, make sure that you cover the interactions between the economic incentives caused by the massive amounts of poverty and how this relates to a lot of illegal activities that are prevalent in Latin America. So obviously there is a direct link between the massive amounts of poverty, say, and the growth of drugs. Massive link between the massive amounts of poverty and the prevalence of bribery in police forces, or say amongst the massive numbers of illegal lodgers who enter into the territory of Amazonian groups. Basically, all of these are people who are desperate to earn a living and to try to sustain themselves in any way they can. The second thing I would say is to always keep an eye on how the weakness of institutions in Latin America means that it's very easy for outsiders and extremists to take power and to destroy, say, the checks and balances that they implement. So I think more important than knowing, like, I don't know, how is it that Chavez destroyed the institutions of Venezuela to empower his small group of cronies who say to be socialists but probably aren't. More important than that is to keep an eye on how easy it is to destroy the institutions in Latin America. And like, yeah, sure, in many pink-tide states, those who destroy the institutions were left-wingers. But I think it's just as plausible that Christian fundamentalists will destroy the institutionality of Latin America in the future. And it's just very likely that narcos are also destroying the institutions of Latin America right now. So basically, keep an eye on how it is that it's impossible to talk politics in Latin America without acknowledging the very fragile nature of the checks and balances and institutions that exist there. Okay, so that's basically it, and thank you very much.